Hello and welcome to the Off the Shelf Festival of Reading and Writing 2021. After a big absence, mostly an absence in 2020, it's absolutely brilliant to be back. We're kind of getting towards the end of the festival. It's been an amazing few weeks. And this is a really, really exciting event for us today. We're going to be talking about this book. It's called Walking the Invisible. Okay, Walking the Invisible. Who knew that it would be about the Brontës? Let me ask you a question. Are you a reader? Are you a walker? Are you both? Are you a Brontë veteran? Are you a Brontë virgin? You could be both. Anyway, our lovely guest and author today, I would say over his lifetime, has been all those things. It's Michael Stewart. He's the reader in creative writing at the University of Huddersfield, so well steeped in the Yorkshire landscape. Michael, it's lovely to see you. Thank you very much for coming on today and talking about this amazing, beautiful, interesting book. The Brontës.
Thank you.
You must have been one of these days. I mean, I've read a lot about you, and to say that you are now a lecturer at the University of Huddersfield, that in your early days, leaving school at the age of 16, you must never in a million years have thought that, today you would be sitting here talking about the Brontës.
No one's more surprised about my trajectory, really, than I am. And no one would be less likely to be here than me. So yeah, it's something I do look back on.
Yeah.
And ponder about quite a lot, really. I saw a friend. I had a school friend who I've known since I was 3, and we just talked all day basically about school days, and it's just so different. That world is just so different. It seems like a foreign land, really.
Well, welcome to your world. Welcome to the world of the Brontës. And this is, as I said, it's a book about the Brontës. It's a book about reading, but it's also really a book about walking and a book about geography. It contains lots of lovely maps, but also it's kind of a bit of a personal journey for you. So I thought that as we go through the book, we talk about the different chapters, because there's a fantastic 12 chapters here, and then at the end we've got the Brontë walks, which we absolutely need to talk about. This is Charlotte Bronte's walk here. We're going to talk about that, and about Emily's, and about Bramwell's, and about Patrick's world as well. So chronologically, we could perhaps start at the very beginning, really, and talk about Brontë père, the dad of the family, Patrick, and his geographical origins in Thornton.
Yeah, well, Patrick's a fascinating character. He was one of 10. He was the eldest of 10 children. He was born in Brontë in 1777 on St. Patrick's Day, hence why he was given the name Patrick. And yeah, by 16 he was running his own school. So he was, although his father was a farm labourer and many of his family were illiterate, he himself excelled educationally. He was running his own school at 16. He came to prominence of various people in the region, and he was sponsored basically to go to St. John's College in Cambridge. One of his sponsors was William Wilberforce. So yeah, he went from some obscure kind of farm in Brontë to be a scholar, a theological scholar at Cambridge, and he was very upwardly mobile. He moved from job to job. He came to Thornton in 1815, having been at Hartshead before that. He more than doubled his salary from that move. So in 1812, when he moved to Hartshead, he was on something like about £40 a year. When he moved to Thornton a few years later, he was on 140. So he was a canny, for a canny, really. And again, when he moved to Haworth, his salary increased again. So he was quite upwardly mobile. He married above his station. His wife, Maria, was from, good stock in Penzance, very middle class, successful merchants. So yeah, he was, I guess what you'd call a yuppie these days, but within the context of a clergyman,
You went to look for him in Thornton, didn't you? That's where you started your journey, looking, following Patrick's footsteps. Yeah. Why Thornton? What did you find there?
Well, Thornton's a fascinating place. It gets left out of the narrative. The attention is often on Haworth, and to some extent that's rightly so. They did write most of the work there, and they were formative years. But Thornton was where they were all born. They were there for 5 years. Patrick described Thornton as the happiest times as a family. It was the only time, really sustained time, they were together as a family, because shortly afterwards, most as soon as he moved to Haworth in 1820, Maria became ill with cancer and died in 1821. The two eldest, Maria and Elizabeth, died a few years after that of TB. So that 5 years in Thornton were the happiest times. For Patrick, it meant a promotion. It was the first time he had his own parsonage. Before that, he was staying in lodgings. He had free time. Thornton was a hotbed of nonconformism. So there were lots of things he didn't have to do, lots of baptisms he didn't have to do, and things like that, and funerals, because they were buried in conformist burial grounds. So it was a fascinating time for Patrick to be there. He had free time, and he did his most sustained bout of writing, really. He wrote the Maid of Killarney while he was there. He wrote The Cottage in the Woods. Two of his, stories that are kind of stretching out to almost be not novellas or novels, really. So he was really stretching himself and being ambitious as a writer at this time, and perhaps thinking of himself as a man of letters, actually. But of course, when he moved to Haworth, everything changed, and his workload changed, and his family changed. He suddenly became a single parent, and everything changed for the worse in many ways, really. So Thornton was a kind of idyllic time for all the family.
So you arrive in Thornton, and in the first chapter in the book sees you scrabbling around, finding paths here and there to try and retrace some of his steps. And you find the building, don't you?
Yeah, well, I go to the Old Bell Chapel, which is where he arrived in 1815, and it was in some state of disrepair. The floor. It was a flagged floor, and the stones were gaping holes, basically. And the practice at the time was to bury the dead underneath the floor, so there was quite a stench of rotting flesh and that kind of thing. So it wasn't a very pleasant place to work. So the first thing he had to do was to raise lots of money, basically, to renovate the chapel. The chapel itself is very old; it's been there since 1612. But there was a chapel before that even, and it was commissioned by a character called Richard Tempest, who lived in the hall next door, Thornton Hall, which was a 3-story estate home. And Richard Tempest was a notorious character. He was justice for the peace for the West Ridings, but he himself was accused of murder and was sentenced and put in prison, awaiting trial, and he died in prison. So he himself was quite, if you're looking for Byronic kind of characters, really, who reign over 3-story estate homes, called a bit like Thornton Hall, then he's your man, really. You know what I mean? Because Thornton Hall with Jane Eyre, it doesn't describe in any way Thornton Hall. But I like to think even then Charlotte was drawing some influence from Thornton, really.
Yeah. Actually, that comes on. It reminds me a little bit of Jane Eyre, but we'll talk about that later on in the house in Hathersage. Okay, so you found that you've been to Thornton, you found Patrick, you found a lot about Patrick. They were very happy days there. Obviously, they were a very happy couple because they not only had the 4 Brontës as we know them now, they had 2 other ones which sadly died when they got to Haworth, and Haworth was really a tragic place for the family. So we'll come on to Haworth a little bit later on, but I just want to talk about the Brontë Stones and your dog Wolfie, because the dog is quite a major character in this book, because you're doing these walks and Wolfie is with you, and in chapter 2, which I absolutely love, chapter 2, you're talking about the Brontë Stones. Wolfie plays a big part, but so does a Hungarian woman called Alina. Tell me about Alina.
Well, Alina contacted me out of the blue, and by the way, on the subject of Wolfie, he's just fast asleep here by my feet. So,
is he? Is he asleep? Oh, that's a shame. I'd like to see him later.
But Alina, so Alina contacted me out of the blue. This is around September 2018, I think it was, and she said she'd organised a walk with a local tour guide called Johnny Briggs, and she was coming from Hungary. She'd booked a plane, she booked a hotel. Basically, it was all set. And then Johnny, unfortunately, had to be taken into hospital. So he basically said, well, it's his walk anyway. The Brontë Stones is his project, so he'll do it. Now, at that point, I'd never even met Johnny Briggs. So it was a complete surprise to me. And she said, would you do it? And I said, well, to be honest with you, I've got something on that weekend and I'm a bit Bronted out. I've done quite a lot of walks around this time. And I sort of declined the offer. And she said, well, you know, I'll give you any money if you'll do it. And I said, well, it's not about the money. She said, well, great, you'll do it then. So I kind of got talked into it, really. So, but I met her in the Old Bell Chapel. And a few days before, I said to her, the Met have issued a severe weather warning. So do turn up with waterproofs and, you know, decent boots and so on, a packed lunch and everything else. And she turned up in spray-on jeans and pumps and an open bag, like a white leather bag with a gold chain, and like a Louis Vuitton style thing, you know. And yeah, she was absolutely crackers. Basically, she introduced herself by saying, "Hello, I am Alina. Are you a pagan?" She said, "Yeah." And it just went on from there, really. So she was quite a character, really. And she had a tattoo on her back of a wolf, so she was very enamored with Wolfie. She saw him as a spirit animal, really, a kind of you know, a companion. What would you call it? Like a was it in Philip Pullman?
Like a soulmate.
Yeah, well, that kind of thing. Yeah. So we had fun, but I was kind of glad when the walk was over. But yeah. Went on the Brontë Stones walk with her, so I took her on the Brontë Stones walk, basically. And the thing is, she'd come on the Friday. She'd flown over on the Friday. She was staying in a hotel Friday night, Saturday night, and going back on the Sunday. So she really just had this one day to do it. So yeah, and miraculously, it didn't rain at all. So yeah.
Maybe she was wielding her pagan powers. What about the Brontë Stones then? Let's talk about the Brontë Stones. This is a project that you did a few years ago and is part of these walks, isn't it? And there's a lot about the Brontë Stones right throughout the book.
Yeah, so the Brontë Stones was something I cooked up in about 2013, actually, and it took me 3 years to get funding for it. So various sort of, you know, obstacles to go through, but I got the funding for it. The idea with the Brontë Stones was to link Thornton, where they were born, to Haworth, where they grew up, really, along a literary trail, and to have stones to mark each of the bicentenaries of the sisters. So originally there were going to be 3 stones. We ended up having funding for 4. So we have the Charlotte Stone, which is positioned in the wall itself of the Brontë birthplace in Thornton. Mark DeLuca, who owns the property, gave me permission to get an angle grinder and actually cut a window into the wall and place a stone. And the then poet laureate, Caroline Duffy, has written her tribute to Charlotte Brontë, which is carved into that stone. So if you go to the birthplace, that's the first thing you'll see next to the blue plaque. And then the second stone is by Jeanette Winterson. These are all favourite writers of mine, all writers that I thought were kind of the equivalent of the Brontes then. I was looking at, you know, writers who were popular, but also pushing the language and doing something interesting and perhaps being a bit controversial. So I was trying to find the kind of modern equivalents to the Brontes. So Jeanette Winterson was a character and a writer that I've long admired. She did the poem for the Brontë Stones, which is kind of like a tribute to all of them. That stands in the cemetery at Thornton. And then halfway along, because the idea is that the stones mark the chronology. So we start with Charlotte in 1816, then Emily in 1818, and then finally Anne in 1820. So Emily's slap bang in the middle of that chronology. And right in the middle of the walk, about 4.5 miles, is an outcrop of rock called Ogden Kirk. And we've carved a tribute to Emily Brontë on that rock. And that is a poem by Kate Bush. And that was something that I had in my mind from the very outset, because I'm a big Kate Bush fan as well as a Brontë fan. And if you know anything about Kate, you'll know she shares a birthday, the 30th of July, with Emily. So when we did that stone, it was Kate Bush's 60th birthday, but it was also Emily's 200th birthday. And of course, Kate Bush owes her entire career to Emily Brontë, because her debut single was Wuthering Heights, which went to #1 and accelerated her into stardom, really. So it was a lovely, lovely sort of thing for Kate to be able to do, really, to write this tribute. And Pip Hall, who's carved all the letters, has managed to carve into what's quite an uneven surface, basically. She's carved this poem, and it's a very good poem. Kate was unsure about it to begin with, and I thought at one point she was going to redact the kind of use of it, but she was okay in the end. And then the final stone is above the parsonage. So that's the Anne stone, and that sits in a field called Parsons Field, just above the parsonage. And Jackie Kay, who's the Scottish Macker, I guess their equivalent of a poet laureate, has written the poem. And it's sort of a homecoming, really. So if you know the Brontës, you know nothing about them, you'll know they're all buried in St. Michael's and All Angels Church in Haworth, in the family vault, except for Anne, who's buried at St. Mary's above Scarborough. So it's a kind of a homecoming, really. And Jackie's done a fantastic job of acknowledging that kind of connection, really. And it triangulates the parsonage with the family vault, and it overlooks moors as well. It's a very nice spot.
Kate Bush and Emily obviously come through a lot in this book, and also you freely admit to an obsession with the song Wuthering Heights from when you were quite little. I'm interested in the fact that you felt that you wanted to contact Kate Bush to do this, and what was she like? Is she also obsessed with Emily Brontë, or is it just the story of Wuthering Heights?
I've never actually met her. I went through her agent, Murray Chalmers, and all the correspondence I've had with Kate has been through Murray Chalmers. She has written to me, and I've written to her, so we have had some lettered correspondence, but I've never actually met her. She's been to see the stone. I know that for a fact because various people have told me the story there. So I know she's been there, but I've never actually met her, and probably never will, really. Yeah.
Is that how it started for you, though? With her song, is that how all this started for you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why. I don't know. It's a bit embarrassing, really, to think back. But when I was in February '78, when it came to #1, it hit. It was Wings' Mulligan Tyre was #1 at the time. I hate it. I thought it was an awful, dreary song. And suddenly, out of nowhere, this song appears, Wuthering Heights, and it knocks it off the #1 spot. And it was, I can't remember how many weeks, but it was on the #1 for quite a long time. And I was 7 years old. I turned 7 a couple of weeks before, and I'd got a cassette recorder, and I just got obsessed by the song. I recorded a C60 cassette full, of this song. And my mother was a little bit worried about me, I think, really. But my mother had been reading the book. My mother left school at 15. She didn't have any qualifications. She was a bit embarrassed about that. When I was a kid, she went to night school to do an English O-level, and she was reading the book. So she told me the story of Wuthering Heights. And I just fell in love with the story, I guess, from my mother, not from the book. I didn't read the book for some years after that.
Okay, well, that kind of brings us quite neatly, actually, onto chapter 3 of Walking the Invisible. And we do need to talk about the title, by the way, don't we? In a minute. We'll do that in a minute. Let's talk about Law Hill School. And Emily went to teach there for a very short length of time, didn't she?
Yeah, it's the only paid work Emily did, really. She was there for 6 months. She moved in September 1838 and left. September 1838 and left in April 1839, I think. She was there 6 months. She didn't seem to have enjoyed the work. She wrote to Charlotte that it was slavery, and she also said that she preferred the school dog to any of the pupils. So I don't think she really got, the place very much. But while she was there, she would have heard the story of the origins of Law Hill. Law Hill was built by Jack Sharp, who was adopted. He was an orphan. He was adopted by John Walker, who was a wealthy wool merchant who lived at Walterclough Hall, about a mile down the hill in South Aram. Now, the thing about this is John Walker was a wealthy wool merchant. He had 4 of his own children, and one of his cousins died, and he adopted his nephew, Jack Sharp. Jack Sharp very quickly won himself in his favours and usurped the 4 children in his favours. And when John Walker died, he left everything to Jack Sharp. Yeah. Now, his eldest son, John, contested this. He was at York University at the time. He contested this and he won because it wasn't a legal thing. He was the heir of the fortune. But by the time he'd come back from York, Jack Sharp had managed to basically strip Walterclough Hall of all its valuables, all its silver, everything else. And out of the proceeds of this, he built Law Hill. And he built Law Hill above Walterclough Hall, looking down on him. Yeah. And then he managed to take John Walker into a dissolute life, into alcoholism and gambling. And there's so many parallels between this and Wuthering Heights. His manservant was called Joseph. Elizabeth Patchett, who ran the school at Law Hill. The Earnshaws were a common name there. You had just over the next hills. This was on Law Hill. The next hill was Pepper Hill. High Sunderland Hall was built there, which resembles the exact description of Wuthering Heights in terms of the entrance, the gargoyles, and the various statues. She would have seen that from a bedroom window. I've been to Law Hill and I've been into the room that Emily stayed in, and she would have seen High Sunderland Hall from her room. So this is 10 years before she wrote Wuthering Heights, and yet she was gathering all this information, all this influence from her 6-month stay at Law Hill. And it's just a fascinating piece of the history, really.
It's in this chapter when you're talking about Law Hill and all the views of Halifax and Deanclough and all that, and you mention Sally Wainwright's piece, television thing called "To Walk Invisible," and that's what this it goes to right at the core of your book, doesn't it? Walking the Invisible. What is to walk invisible?
Well, this is something Charlotte said while she was still using the pen name Curabell. She said that to be an author, you had to walk invisible, basically. In other words, in order to, I guess, be in the world as a writer, to observe the world, you couldn't be present in that observation. You couldn't be a celebrity. Because how can you observe ordinary people go about their business? How can you be influenced by? This is how I interpret it, anyway. How can you do the job of writing if you are the object of the people that you're around as an audience? You know what I mean? So of course she became that, didn't she? Shortly after she said that. So there's a kind of irony when she says this. She doesn't realize she is going to be the exact thing she's talking about. So it's kind of ironic, really. And what I'm doing really is I'm walking the invisible, because a lot of these things are not present. They've been erased. A High Sunderland Hall does not exist anymore. It was knocked down in the 1950s. If you go to the site at the base of Pepper Hill, there's not a scrap of that hall. And it was a vast castle. It was huge. There is no evidence of that at all, bizarrely. And in the 60s, somebody came into Shibden Hall with a box of statues, and there's a pillar and some other artifacts. This is all that remains of High Sunderland Hall, and they're in the yard of Shibden Hall. They've just been dumped in the yard in the 60s, and they're still there, and there's not even a nameplate or a plinth or anything to say. And I keep going in there and saying, why don't you just put a notice to say these are from High Sunderland Hall? Oh, we're short-staffed, and this has been going on for years, so I don't know if they'll ever do that.
How did you feel, though, when you go into these places and you imagine, you have to then call on your imagination, don't you? Or call on their writings in order to reconstruct in your head or in anybody else's head what it must have been like. How do you feel? Does that make you feel sad or just a little bit kind of whimsical about it all?
Well, you're walking with two views of the landscape all the time. So the landscape that you see, and then the landscape that you imagine. So you erase the pylons and the wind turbines and the new built houses and so on. And what you see actually is a lot of that landscape remains. The enclosure, all of the dry stone walls you see are a result of the Enclosures Acts from 1600, for 100 odd years. So that's the kind of landscape that Emily would have seen. Obviously, a lot of the houses wouldn't have been there. If you go to Law Hill, as I did, and I stood in Emily's bedroom, and you look at the view she saw, you can basically erase everything between where she was and High Sunderland Hall, because none of those houses existed. So she would have just had a clear view right across, and she would have just looked at that and thought, what the hell is that? Incredible. And it was a bizarre, Gothic, strange building, eccentric in many ways, and of course somebody like Emily would have just been drawn to it like a moth to a flame. So yeah, as I'm walking all the time, I'm walking with, if you like, two, like we're talking now, aren't we, with two screens? Yeah, that's how I'm walking. I'm looking at what I'm seeing, and I'm projecting the past onto that view, if that makes sense.
Oh, it absolutely makes sense. Yeah, that's you put that really, really succinctly. We did. I don't know if you're going to be able to, in a few minutes, read a little bit from your book. It would be really, really nice. But I'd like to move on to a chapter which you call Emily's boots, and what struck me was some lovely little personal details about the girls and Bramwell as well, in the difference in their heights, in that Charlotte was really quite little, and Emily was really quite big, and the other two were in between, and that just gives such a lovely picture of them.
Yeah, I mean, we don't really know exactly how tall or short they were, so we could only go off things like the coffin. They were measured for the coffins and that kind of thing, and off the artifacts that remain, the clothing and the shoes and things like that. So you can get somewhere close, and people, various writers and various academics have estimated, slightly different heights. I think Emily was about 5'10", something like that, and Charlotte was probably about 4'11". So there's quite a difference. There's about almost a foot difference, isn't there? Which is quite unusual, actually, among siblings. Why is that? I don't quite know. Patrick himself was reasonably tall, but his son Bramwell was quite short. Who knows why that is? Whether they were just malnourished or what it was really. But certainly, what always fascinates me, and there's no extant footwear of Emily, so we don't know what she walked in or any of that kind of thing. So we can only guess really, but it would have been hobnail boots. And they may have wore patterns. I think it's unlikely Emily would have wore patterns really, because they were so obstructive and would have been difficult to walk in really. So I think she probably walked in hobnail boots. Now, if you think about, walking 20 miles in the latest kind of high tech kind of boots, it's a very different experience, isn't it? And certainly when I'm walking, I'm thinking, what would it be like to be shawled with a woolen shawl and be wearing hobnail boots rather than have these fantastic, state-of-the-art Gore-Tex lined boots and whatever else. So yeah, so it's called Emily's Boots in two senses. That I'm also walking in her footsteps. Really, I'm walking around the moors, 5 moors that surround Haworth.
Yeah, right. Okay, so let's go now from the moors to your big walk to Liverpool in Mr. Earnshaw's footsteps. Now that was a big one for you, and you did get sore feet, even though you were wearing your high-tech boots, not hobnail ones.
Well, a lot of that was road walking, and it wasn't a very pleasant walk actually. Once I got past Littleborough, really, it was mainly road walking, and I walked to Liverpool over 3 days. I retraced Mr. Earnshaw's journey in Wuthering Heights. As you know, he travels in 1771, and he returns with an orphan child who he calls Heathcliff after his dead son, which is a curious act of intimacy. And he does it in 3 days there and back, which is some going, because I'm not a slow walker, and it took me 3 days to get there. And the last leg of it actually was absolutely miserable, because you're walking on really quite industrial roads with big lorries coming past you, and they're splurging brick dust and cement, and I had like a face mask by the end of it of this kind of crusty powder. So it wasn't a pleasant walk at all. And when I got there, I thought, what the hell did that for, really? Stupid thing.
But you've got the right at the end of that chapter, you've got a theory of why he went, and you thought he went for a slave.
Yeah, I mean, I'm giving the spoilers away here. So my novel Ill Will really tackles this. This is my novel Ill Will is about Heathcliff missing years, and he goes back to Liverpool to trace his origins. And what he discovers is that he's the son of a slave. I think that's the most likely scenario. I think Mr. Earnshaw was traveling to Liverpool with a set purpose. I think he was meeting someone. I don't think you'd get there and back. He only had a few hours there, basically. That's not stopping to eat or sleep, So he had something fixed in his diary. He was going there to meet someone. I think, Liverpool at the time, Liverpool was the biggest slave port in Europe. As a farmer, he had no business in Liverpool. There were lots of market towns around. There would have been Leeds and Keighley and Bradford and so on. It was the middle of summer, a very busy time for farmers. He had horses in the stables. Joseph talks about the horses. He didn't take the horses. He walked. Why does he walk? There's a coach from Keighley to Liverpool. Why does he walk? It's a surreptitious thing to do, isn't it? And he returns with a son, an orphan son that he's named after his dead son, that he says he found it, and he couldn't find its owner. So yeah, all of the clues I think Emily's put in the book point to one thing, really.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's going to be a new book of yours, Ill Will. We mentioned that a little bit later on. Let's go to Bramwell next, and the Lake District, because this is another little different. You know, we're in the moors, we've done a bit of Liverpool, now we're in the Lake District and talking about Bramwell, aren't we?
Yeah, so Bramwell dabbled in lots of things, really. You know, he tried to be a portrait. He had a studio in Bradford, in the centre of Bradford, for about 6 months, something like that. Didn't succeed. I mean, he wasn't a terrible painter, but he just wasn't a great painter. He just, you know, he was kind of okay, really. And he just didn't take off, you know. So he tried that for a bit. And then he was a tutor. He went to Broughton-in-Furness to tutor 2 boys. And he didn't last very long. He got there, I think New Year's Day, I think he got there. And he lasted, I think, maybe about 9 or 10 months. It's Juliet Barker puts forward the theory that he sired an illegitimate child at the time, and it does seem likely. It's a very convincing case. It seems like he had something going on with one of the maids, and he had to leave town, basically. It looks like that child died in very early infancy. He wrote a poem about it, actually, which is almost certainly about that incident. You know, if you read the poem, it just is. So he comes back, having failed at being a tutor, and then he tries to be a railway clerk, and he fails at that, and he tries to be a poet, and he has some success as a poet. He's the first published of all his siblings, you know, and he does quite well. He wants to write a novel. He doesn't succeed in doing that. You know, he then is a tutor again at Thorpe Green and has an affair with Lydia, and that goes horribly wrong. So everything he tried, really, bless him, it didn't sort of end up well for him, really.
Poor old Bramwell. We're talking to Michael Stewart. We're talking about Walking the Invisible, which is his book about the Brontës, about where they lived, where the views they might have seen in various parts of the country during their lifetime. And Michael has done these walks, in fact, has mapped these walks, which you can see at the end of the book. Would you like to read a little passage from your book, Michael?
I'd love to, yeah. Okay, so I thought, because we've been talking about Alina, it'd be quite nice to meet her. Yeah. So basically I take Alina on this walk, the Brontë Stones walk. And as I say, I met her, first of all, at the Old Bell Chapel, and she introduced herself in this way. And she actually said, "Are you a pagan?" And I said, "Yeah, sort of, I guess, you know." And she said, "Good, I knew you were a pagan. I knew you were a pagan. I am a pagan. I hate Christians, I hate Muslims, and I hate Romanians." That was the way she introduced herself. And I thought, okay, this is going to be an interesting walk. And it proved to be so, yeah. So I'm just going to read the little bit before we get to the Emily Stone, which is the stone we were talking about on Ogden Kirk, in the middle of the walk and in the most remote place. And this is a spot which was a well-known Victorian picnic spot at the time. Patrick, in fact, took his family there in 1818, the year of Emily's birth. So she would have known about this. This is all in Elizabeth I's diaries. This is all things you can cross-reference. We turn left through a gate and drop down to join Foreside Lane, which leads past the ruins of Ash Tree Farm. The path crosses bleak and dramatic moorland, and despite the clouds, the view is clear for many miles around. The moor undulates with dark tracts of peat bog, green ridges of fern, and patches of purple heather. Behind us looms the large ridge of land that encompasses Bingley, Ilkley, and Rombold's Moor. In front of us looms the less elevated Ovenden Moor. "These are the moors that inspired Emily," I say. "Ah, yes, the moor. I take picture." We soon reach Ogden Kirk and the Emily Stone. Kirk is a local word for rock. It rises up from Hebble Brook at the cusp of Thornton Moor. This jagged hump stands sentinel over Skirden Edge. When the sun shines on its face, it sparkles with spots of quartz, tiny diamonds embedded in the skin of the stone. It's the most remote spot along the 9-mile Brontë Stones walk from Thornton to Haworth, from where the Brontës were born to where they matured into adulthood. The face of the kirk is mottled with ochreous orange and murky black patches, freckled with green lichen. It brings to mind fire and iron. Where Pip has cut into the Kirk's skin with tungsten chisels, the rock beneath is exposed and has a bright yellow colour that shines gold in sunlight. The words are framed by cragged ridges of stone and fretted with verdant ferns. And I'll read the poem out. She stands outside, a book in her hands. Her name is Cathy, she says. I have carried her so far, along the unmarked road from our graves. I cannot reach this window, open it, I pray. But his window is a door to a lonely world that longs to play. Ah, Emily, come in and stay. Kate Bush's poem is something of a mystery. The first line, she stands outside, is perhaps a reference to the first lines of a song, This Woman's Work. Emily has carried her character Cathy to her grave, and now she stands outside a window. The window which she cannot reach is perhaps a reference both to the scene in Wuthering Heights, when Cathy's ghost appears outside the sleeping Lockwood's bedchamber, and also to the lyrics of Bush's 1978 debut, with the refrain, and I won't sing this, let me in at your window. It is in any case a porthole to another world. Elena and I stop to read the poem. As we do, the sun appears from behind the clouds and illuminates the rock face, so that letters glow gold and the tiny diamonds of quartz sparkle in the light like stars. It is destiny, Elena says. We read the poem. Elena takes pictures. I extract my lunch from my rucksack, a sandwich and a broth from my flask. Do you want some? I have big breakfast, English breakfast, very big. They share the same birthday, I say. Who? Emily and Kate, the 30th of July. Kate Bush was 60 this year, the same year as Emily's bicentenary. It's also 40 years since Kate's debut single, Wuthering Heights, reached #1 in the charts here. Ah, yes, I read this in magazine. This is where your love of Emily Brontë starts. You were a child, and you listened to the song. She's done her homework. I just turned 7, I say. I got a tape machine for my birthday. I taped the song off the radio. I was obsessed by it. I filled a C60 cassette with it. I think my mum was worried about me. She took me to one side and told me the story of Wuthering Heights. And this is where you began? I suppose. What is it about this song? I don't know. I think it was the lyrics. This woman asking to be let in at the window. I couldn't work out why she didn't just use the door. You were a strange child. My mother thought so, yes. I'll stop there.
That's absolutely lovely. It's the Off the Shelf Festival, which is Sheffield's Festival of Reading and Writing. So let's come a little bit closer to South Yorkshire. In fact, North Derbyshire and the Peak District, Michael, as we're talking about walking the invisible, and to North Lees Hall in Hathersage, which is the inspiration for Jane Eyre. And you came to North Lees Hall and had a little bit of a poke around. What did you find?
Well, North Lees Hall is one of the said to be influences on Thornfield Hall in Jane Eyre, and it's just about a mile from Hathersage, where Ellen Nussey was living at the time with Henry Nussey, with a brother who was about to get married. Henry had first of all proposed to Charlotte. She turned him down gently, and he was getting married. So her and Charlotte came to the house to kind of prepare for the wedding. So she was there for some weeks, and they visited North Lees Hall. North Lees Hall was owned by the Eyres. There was a woman called Eyre staying there at the time. There had also been some time before a mad woman in the attic who was confined to the attic who set fire to the building. So there's lots of parallels there. The description of Thornfield Hall in Jane Eyre fits very, very closely that of North Lees Hall. It's bigger in the book, but the location and the exterior and the castellated front, all of the things in the book match very, very closely. It's sometimes said that Norton Coiners is the influence. Giles Banworth was stating this on a documentary for Channel 5, I think, a few months back. it doesn't really fit at all. If you go to Norton Coiners, you know, I don't buy that at all. There's no real evidence that Charlotte even went to Norton Coiners. We know for a fact she went to Northlees Hall, and we know that the Eyres lived there. The Eyres were a big family. Their brasses are in the church above in the village of Hathersage. You can go and see them. So there's lots and lots and lots of things there. You know, the village itself of Hathersage fits that of Jane Eyre. You know, they're needle makers, basically. There's not that many places where, you know, it's famous for needle making. So there's lots and lots of things that coincide with Northlees Hall. And I visited it with an academic called Claire O'Callaghan, who had written a fantastic essay called Queering Mr. Rochester, which gives a kind of quite a subversive take on that character, you know. And I was just bowled away by this idea of Mr. Rochester. And once you've read Claire's essay, and then you go back to the scenes in the book, and you go back to him, you know, the nursing scene with Mason when he's opening his shirt, and you know, it is quite homoerotic, you know, and you can see the book in a different light, essentially. So yeah, the two of us had this walk, and then we walked up to Stanage Edge, and again, this is mentioned in the book in Jane Eyre. There were lots of chapters where the description of the landscape that surrounds Thornfield Hall, it talks about this large ridge of rock. Well, that's exactly Stanage Edge, you know. So it's kind of penned in Northlees Hall. It's very secluded, got very interesting atmosphere. It's got very spooky fairy tale Rapunzel-like quality about it.
Yeah, I know it well. I've been there a few times, and people around Sheffield will know that part of the Peak District very, very well. They'll know High Neb. They'll know High Neb. They'll know Stanage Edge, and they might not quite know Northlees Hall because it's just tucked around the corner. It's a very beautiful part. Okay, shall we skip over to Scarborough and talk about Anne Brontë now? Let's do it.
Okay, yeah. So Anne is dying of TB at the time when she visits Scarborough, and my chapter basically traces the last 3 days. She arrives on the Friday with Ellen, Nussey, and Charlotte. They alight the train from York, so they travel from Keighley to York. They stay a night in York. They buy a few things for the trip, you know, garments and so on. They get to Scarborough on the Friday, and by the Monday, Anne is dead. And I trace the last 3 days, really. She goes to a bathhouse opposite the lodgings on the cliff where the Robinsons used to. So I should just say that Anne was a governess for the Robinsons who lived at Thorpe Green. And they had a holiday home basically in Scarborough, and they used to go up quite a lot. And it was a very happy time for Anne. You know, she very much enjoyed Scarborough. It was I think for Anne, it must have been very liberating to be in this place suddenly, you know, with this big sky and the sea and this expansive kind of scenery. Of course, Scarborough at the time was an affluent and ostentatious. It's not like it is today. It's very run down, isn't it? Sadly. It's the centre of the £1 a pint lager bars, and it's one of the highest opioid deaths in the country. So when I'm tracing her steps, I'm kind of comparing then with now. You know, those bathhouses, a bit like Bath, I guess, really, you know, were populated by the gentry. They'd come up from London and they'd take the waters in the bath. It was said to be curative. Anne had gone there to perhaps cure herself of TB, but perhaps she knew even then she was dying and she just wanted to be away from her father. Bearing in mind that her father had buried Bramwell in September 1848, and then Emily in December, 3 months later, 1848. This is now May 1849, so there's only, 8 months or something between. And if she did know she's dying, I would imagine she wouldn't want to put her father through the trauma of burying yet another child. Now, there's various theories. You know, she may have been hedging her bets and thinking, well, I might be dying, but I'm going to try my best to survive. At the time, they believed in miasma theory. In other words, they didn't believe in germs. They didn't have any knowledge of germs. It wasn't until the 1870s, Robert Koch, a German scientist, discovered smallpox. He discovered a virus. But before that, they just believed it was unclean air, basically. It was matter in the air. And they thought that if you went to somewhere like Scarborough, where there was lots of clean air, you could cure yourself of TB. We know that's not true, but they believed that. So she may have gone there to cure herself, or she may have gone there just to save her father the pain of burying another child. But certainly she gets there and she's already very, very unwell. Charlotte writes to Ellen to warn her basically of her state. She said her arms are so thin, they're like a pencil and things like that, So she was already very, very ill at this time. She goes to the bathhouse over the road, which is now with the Grand Hotel. I should say where the lodgings, where the Robinsons' holiday home was, is now the Grand Hotel. So there's no evidence of that either. There's a blue plaque, but apart from that. And the Travis bathhouse was over the gardens. And she went there. She collapsed on the way back. So she wasn't even well enough to just walk a short distance. She took a donkey cart ride. And on the Monday morning, she was too unwell to even get out of bed. Ellen Nussey carried her downstairs, and she had a breakfast of boiled milk. That's all she could manage. And she died, I think, around 2:00 in the afternoon on the Monday. And her last words were, "Take courage." The last words to Charlotte were, "Take courage." So she was, even at the very end, there was no self-pity there or anything really. So it's an extraordinary story of what a character she was, really. A self-possessed, extraordinary strong character to the end.
I'm kind of feeling uplifted, but also really, really sad about that. We've kind of gone through this fantastic book. I must say, I really loved it, Michael. I really did. I think really it would be really nice to sort of finish, well, before we finish, to talk about these walks. You've got some maps at the end here, and we've got the Charlotte Brontë walk, the Brontë Stones walk, the Emily walk, the Anne walk, and then the Wandering Bard walk. And I just thought it would be, maybe you could just talk us through. I know you've got some images to show us, and these obviously these maps are within the book, and they're quite easy to follow, really, because you not only do the map, but you also do a description of the walks as well. And I know you've talked us through most of them, haven't you, as we've been chatting over the last 45 minutes or so. But if you could just explain how the maps work, that would be really nice.
Yeah, so the maps are drawn and designed by a cartographer I work with called Christopher Goddard. And I've known Christopher for a long time. He worked on a project called the Brontë Stones, and he's done a lot of things. If you go into any Yorkshire bookshop, you'll see his books. They're fantastic. He's done a series of books about the Yorkshire moors, a series of books about the Yorkshire woodlands, lots of other books, walking books, and I've done many of his walks. And he's very much in that Wainwright tradition. And when I was a kid, I was a bit obsessed by Wainwright. There wasn't many books in my house, but I lived very close to a library. I lived in, I grew up in Salford, so there was no access to countryside. But the way that I got around that was to read Wainwright's books and just imagine the walks. I never went on any of these walks. I just used to read Wainwright going on these walks. If you know Wainwright, he had these hand-drawn maps and descriptions of the walks, but there were also kind of memoirs as well, because he was talking about himself. And so this book, in a way, is a bit of a tribute, but certainly Christopher Goddard's work is in that tradition, I guess. So it was really, really nice to work with Christopher. He's a fantastic cartographer, and we worked together on these projects. And the idea was to have a linear walk from Thornton to Haworth, which took in all 4 stones, but also to have different walks of different severities and different styles. So there's a Charlotte walk, which is a 4.5 mile walk around Thornton. Yeah, traces Patrick's steps and some of the key aspects of the early life of the Brontës. There's the Anne Brontë walk. I wanted to sort of do a walk which, when people go to Haworth, they always do the same thing. They go to see the Brontë waterfall. They go to Top Withens. And it's a very, very well walked and well worn path. And I wanted to kind of encourage people to discover other aspects of Haworth. So the Anne walk is a very secluded, tranquil walk which goes up to the kind of the less walked bits of Haworth, if you like. Yeah, and you very rarely see anyone on that walk. It's about 7 miles. It's a very, very nice walk. Quite a gentle walk as well. There's not much climbing to do, or anything like that. So I tried to get the walks to match the characters of the sisters as well. And then the final walk, the Emily walk, is, as you'd imagine, the most strenuous. It's a 15-mile yomp across the 5 moors that surround Haworth. So, we know Emily walked all day. Well, this is a walk that'll take you all day. It'll take you 8, 9, 10 hours, whatever, And it takes in all of the places that influenced Emily, Pondon Hall and Pondon Kirk, Top Withens and so on, Alcomden Stones. All these places are in the walk. The Wandering Bard walk was something that Christopher did for Bramwell's bicentenary in 2017. And it's a linear walk, it's a 12-mile walk from London Foot, where Bramwell was then a railway clerk. And there's a hideous sculpture to mark that. It's a grotesque thing. The station itself no longer exists. It's an industrial park. But there is a horrible gargoyle-y thing that somebody has sculpted. And that's a walk which Bramwell would have done as he walked home to Haworth. That's a 12-mile walk. It's a very, very pleasant walk through Ludington Dean, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous part of the country. So they're all different types of walks. They're all different ways of immersing yourself in the Brontes landscapes. But the maps are also available separately as well. If you want to get the maps and take them with you, you can buy them from various bookshops. You can buy them from the BronteStones.com website. The Parsonage sell them, the Haworth Parsonage. You know, the Book Corner in Halifax, the Bookcase in Hebden, Salts Mill bookshop. So there's lots of shops around the region where you can buy the maps, or just from the BronteStones.com.
Excellent. All right, we've got a couple of minutes left, Michael. I know you wanted to talk about Ill Will. We've mentioned it briefly a little bit earlier on.
Yeah, and it very much led to this book. So one of the things, so Ill Will is about Heathcliff's missing years. If you know the book, you know Wuthering Heights, you'll know that in the summer of 1780, he overhears Cathy say it would degrade her to marry him, and he runs off in a storm. He's missing for 3 years. When he returns, he's educated, he's well-dressed, he's well-spoken, and he's wealthy. But he also has a sadistic streak he didn't have when he left. He left as an uncouth stable boy. He returns with this sadistic streak. And it's always fascinating with this whole narrative. Emily cleverly doesn't tell you what he's done. So my book basically starts with him running off in the storm. And in my story, he goes to Liverpool to trace his origins. But one of the things I did to write the book was to write on the hoof. I wandered the moors. I walked from Haworth to Liverpool in character as Heathcliff with Wolfie, my dog. And I had a dictaphone, and I wrote large chunks of that book as I walked. And I'd never written in that way before. And I really found that liberating, and I really enjoyed that way of writing. And that's what led to this book, really, Walking the Invisible, because I thought I would love to write a book in this way where I just walk and talk and write on the hoof. And this is how I've constructed Walking the Invisible. All of these chapters were written on the moors and in the landscape I was immersed in. I obviously came back and reworked them and researched and added things, but essentially that's the origins of each of these chapters in me walking those landscapes. And I hope when people read it, they get that impression, you know, that they're immersed in the landscape. There's also an audio book as well. So if you actually want to go on the moors and immerse yourself in the book, you can listen to the book while you're actually in the landscape. So that was very important to me, that this is not just a book I'm sat in a studio or an office writing on a desk. This is a book that takes you out into the landscape and for you to discover the places that I think are so important, really, for you to get how the Brontes were as people, but also as writers.
And it's absolutely lovely. I guess sort of to sum up, really, we are all a product of the places we've lived, whether it's the Brontes, whether it's you, whether it's me, whether it's everybody watching our talk today. It's been fantastic. Love your book. It's brilliant. It's been an absolute honour to talk to you, Michael. Thank you so much. It's Michael Stewart, reader in creative writing at the University of Huddersfield, and his wonderful book is called Walking the Invisible. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you, Tricia, and thank you, Off the Shelf. I've really enjoyed this event. Thank you very much. And thank you, audience, for watching.